All right, let's get started.
I mean, at least we're getting outsiders. I mean,
I know. Outsiders comes in and about who's in the right, who's in the right with me.
All right, so what I mentioned last time is that this will be our last one-off 1 week for a little while. So next time we begin 3 weeks of Nietzsche. And you know, the reading load remains about the same. So pace yourselves. Nietzsche should be a little bit easier than Hegel, actually. So, although it will take some getting used to, and the first text that we're reading by Nietzsche is perhaps the most difficult. So, The Birth of Tragedy. So the three Nietzsches that we're going to do are The Birth of Tragedy, On the Genealogy of Morals. Also another side piece to that will be Truth and Lie in an Extra Moral Sense. And then finally the case of Wagner. And you'll see that Wagner figures very prominently in The Birth of Tragedy as well. So we will start getting into some further musical examples more thoroughly than we've had so far. I think that we had the Ode to Joy. That's it. Last time. But music will be a major example for Nietzsche, who himself was a musician. The first text of Nietzsche that we're reading is the early Nietzsche. So you'll see as well that he prefaces it with a later self-criticism. So the later Nietzsche looks back on his early work and has a self-criticism of it. And that little introductory self-criticism is actually quite important to work through. Volunteers for our first week of Nietzsche. Anybody? Okay, that's one. Okay, you guys, coordinate. In the back. Great, looking good. All right. So we're doing 1 week of Hegel, which is a little bit crazy. And we're not going to be able to do all of Hegel's philosophy, of course. But we will review some things from Kant, especially as they pertain to Hegel's own criticism of Kant and Schiller in this text. But I want to say something just a little bit as pertains the general historical moment of Hegel. So we're now moving ahead. We were in 1794 last time with Schiller. So we were at the height of the French Revolution. And now we're in the post-French Revolutionary period. We're in the period more solidly, I mentioned last time, of Romanticism. So Romanticism is kind of emergent with Schiller, but it's really much more of a contemporary phenomenon for Hegel. And we didn't get into the poetry examples last time. We didn't have time to get into the Holderlin in particular. So Holderlin was a college roommate of Hegel's, who's an important figure for Hegel and kind of stands in for Romanticism, for this kind of romantic moment and a kind of romantic consciousness. And so we might say that for Hegel, the issue is the necessity of the present. So this is not, the philosophy of history per se has not figured very prominently in our reading so far in Kant and Schiller. Again, Schiller makes a kind of a side note about the political moment and how it might not be particularly propitious for discussions of art and aesthetics. And Kant brought in society and history a little bit around the edges. But now, of course, we're dealing much more thoroughly with the historical character of the subject. So we have to go all the way back to the first week of class, to the Robert Pippin piece that we read on critical theory, in order to recall how Pippin articulates this, that he really makes Hegel responsible for the historicizing move, even though you could say that that's already been the case implicitly in the readings that we did, more explicitly in other writings by Kant, also with Schiller, and even before that, Rousseau, who Pippin throws under the bus a little bit, like calls him just the romantic recoil against modernity. But that does pertain. So that romantic recoil against modernity, which Pippin associates also with postmodernism, is a kind of complaint against or a bemoaning of kind of regret at modernity that is associated with Romanticism. So the idea that history had taken a wrong turn, that somehow we've lost our way, we've lost the plot here. That's something that Hegel is responding to. He's really arguing against that very centrally in his work. So the example of art is particularly relevant if you recall the way Pippin put it, that art is a site for us to diagnose and analyze the pathology of the present. It's not so much Hegel's concern here. Rather, with Hegel, the issue is the loss of a sense of a canon. So when we've talked about the isms, the movements, the art historical periods, classicism, romanticism, and then we'll get later to realism and modernism. We have done that, or we've not done that? Have we talked about that? Yeah, we looked at the timeline? Okay, because we've been without dry erase markers for a while. So I wasn't sure when we might have done that and if we had done it. So classicism brings us up to really Kant's moment and still informs Schiller to a great degree. And that's the sense of, it's a kind of a bourgeois, post-Renaissance, humanistic conception of our faculties, our practices, for instance, art. So the kind of universal sense of art, both cross-culturally and transhistorically. So the idea that kind of constantly building a canon of the beautiful, or as Hegel put it, a pantheon of the beautiful in art history. Perhaps with some interruptions along the way, but nonetheless, there is a sense of continuity. For instance, the Middle Ages. With Romanticism, there's a loss of a sense of our ability in the present to participate in that canon, to do what the masters, what the classics did, what the Renaissance masters did, what the classical works of art were able to accomplish. In Schiller, one of the supplemental readings that we had in the collection of essays by Schiller, so we focused on in class the Letters on the Aesthetic Education of Man, but we had another essay on naive and sentimental poetry, in which Schiller said that there are two kinds of poets, and by poet, of course, he means artist. There's the naive artist, and there's the sentimental artist. So the naive artist, through their work, and perhaps in their personality as well, tries to be nature, whereas the sentimental artist kind of points to and yearns after nature. Right? So the kind of prodigious, spontaneous creativity of nature is emulated by the naive artist. Whereas the sentimental artist, it's a little bit more removed, and this is what we would associate with Romanticism. The sense that we can only point to or yearn after, but not actually embody, enact, instantiate that spontaneity. And these terms are, they're particular. We have to pay attention to the terminology in the readings that we're doing in the particular writings, how the specific authors, but also the particular writings use terms and categories. But a lot of this language is more prevalent than it is for us now. So Nietzsche, next week, we'll talk about Raphael, who's an important Renaissance painter, as a wonderfully naive artist who's able to just sort of do something. So Nietzsche will be using that term very similarly. But the idea that we've lost the ability to do that, like even when we talked about genius in Kant, in our second reading from Kant, the combination of talent and education, right? What it takes to be original, what it takes to produce genius, but also what it might take to recognize genius, right? So a critic, a viewer might also have to have a talent in terms of their ability to experience art and recognize its original character. Right, so there's a kind of reciprocal moment there, and I think that I mentioned at the time, recalling Susan Buck-Morss, the task of artists is to sustain the critical moment of aesthetic experience, and the task of critics is to recognize it. Right, so that kind of reciprocal action. Now, where we are now with Hegel is that he's, of course, emphasizing the second part. So he is not like Schiller, he's more like Kant. He's not an artist. Hegel's not an artist. And also, unlike Nietzsche next time, Hegel's not an artist. And so Hegel is more concerned with the task of the critic, or we might say, even more so, the task of the philosopher. And how maybe it doesn't take some special genius or talent on the part of the critic or the philosopher to understand art. Right? But maybe there's something in formal philosophy that can be of aid. And not only that, but is necessary. There's a kind of necessary moment of criticism. Again, Buck-Morss, like Pippin, is leaning a great deal on Hegel in her whole conception of things. Sort of between the lines there, more explicit with Pippin. That criticism is not ancillary or superfluous, but is actually necessary. And that's the difficulty that Hegel's trying to address. That the artwork can't be like nature, it can't stand on its own. It can't just be itself, but it actually needs to be understood. It needs concepts, it needs theories, it needs philosophy. It needs history, it needs a formal art history in order to make sense. So a viewer or a reader or a listener in the case of music actually has to be informed in order for the artwork to actually be itself. For the Romantics, who are Hegel's contemporaries, that's a kind of fatal loss to the artwork. The fact that the artwork might need criticism or theory or art history or philosophy means that it's not able to be itself, that the artwork is not able to actually be what it's supposed to be. For Hegel, the idea is, and we'll see how plausible we find this, that actually this is an advance. This is an advance for humanity. It's an advance in our freedom. It's an advance in our society. It's a historical advance for us to move from that more naive and spontaneous production and reception of art to a more conceptually and philosophically mediated one. So the easiest way to describe this is in the nature of society itself. So it's something that we're going to talk about, and I'm actually going to bring up a chart for us to look at. So we've talked about so far the dialectic of being and becoming. That was really very central for us with Kant and Schiller. Now we need to get into this other business, which is here's a mouthful, the immanent dialectical critique of phenomena. Right. So critique, we're still with Kantian critique. We're still with exploring conditions of possibility for transformation. Right, so the whole upper chart is here. But now we're getting into what it looks like procedurally. Right? So this isn't a method so much as it's a procedure. It's not supposed to be a schema, it's supposed to be a way of proceeding. It would be a kind of an approach, a process. So the immanent dialectical critique of phenomena. Now, first of all, phenomena. Phenomena. So we're dealing with phenomenal forms, we're dealing with appearances, we're dealing with the way things appear to us. And these phenomena, and again, this is building on Kant, so this isn't new to Hegel, but it is more foregrounded in terms of our ability to work through the Hegel. We have to consider this more directly. The phenomena are not arbitrary, they're not accidental, and therefore they're not mistaken or deceptive, but they're necessary. So the way things appear to us, they're necessary forms of appearance. With what necessity do things appear the way they do to us? Not necessary in the sense of a kind of logical determination, but necessary in another sense. Meaning they're telling us something about not just the way that the world is, but what we ought to do, what we could and should, what we must do. So it has the character of a task. The way the world appears to us tasks us. Right? So it's not necessary in the sense of a condition of logical necessity, like a necessary but insufficient logical condition of possibility. No, it's rather necessary in the sense of it expresses our necessity to do something, and to do something transformative. So in that sense, the phenomenon, the appearance or the semblance, so this is the word that we've been dealing with in the German since the course. Let's just make a side note. It's all Krauts all the time. I think we're reading all Germans. Wordsworth was our one non-German writer, right? And he might be an honorary German in his temperament because he was a romantic. But anyway, no, he's English, especially his rejection of the French Revolution, very English. So, Erscheinung. Right, so phenomenon, appearance, semblance, when we encounter these words in the text, it's all the same word, it's Erscheinung. So the phrase from Hegel that helps us articulate this is the essence must appear. The essence must appear. The essence or substance must appear. But what is the essence or the substance? Well, the essence or substance of things is freedom, namely how things can and should change, could and should change. So now that we're getting into Hegel, we're getting into much more dialectical kind of articulation. We talked about the extant versus the actual, about nature and spirit, the is and the ought. Well, here's another word that we didn't get so much from Kant and Schiller, and nonetheless, Hegel's going to wield it, and it's going to bewitch us a bit. Truth. 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 Right? So the truth of something in the way that it appears to us. Right? So appearance is not arbitrary, accidental, potentially mistaken, or false. But appearances are true. That's what it means to say that they're necessary. But the truth of something is not merely as it exists, but as it could and should be transformed. So the truth of something is in its actuality, not merely as it exists. The actuality of something is the truth of something, meaning how it suggests its own self-transformation. So that's what we're looking for in the realm of appearance. We're looking for the possibility, but also the necessity of change. And if you recall from Pippin, art has a diagnostic function. It has a symptomatic function too. So we also had from Hamza Walker and Susan Buck-Morse a notion that art is symptomatic and emblematic, I think is the phrase that Susan Buck-Morse used. Symptomatic and emblematic, so what is a symptom? Symptom of what? Symptom of pathology. And this word expression, I'll throw this in here. So Erscheinung, phenomenon, appearance, semblance. Phenomenon, not a representation of something. Handy way of thinking about things, just to keep in mind, a little mental figure to keep in mind. We're not dealing with theories of representation here. Right? So art is not a representation. It's not like a copy. It's an expression. That's the word that you have to keep in mind. Not representation, but expression. Right. But expression of what? Okay. So expression of pathology, expression of suffering, pathos, logi, the logic of suffering or the reason for suffering. It's going to be very important when we get to Nietzsche next time. Why do we take pleasure in tragedy, which is all about the presentation of suffering, right? What does Aristotle suppress in his notion of tragedy? So an expression of suffering, but not ordinary suffering, suffering in a more geistic, spiritual sense of a need and a task for transformation. So suffering from our unfreedom, from which we get the task of our struggle for freedom. And so the pathos of the phenomenon, the symptomatic character. The diagnostic character is that it's a symptom that diagnoses itself. It's a symptom that also registers the cause, not just the effect. So it's not symptom merely as an effect, but it's also expressing, revealing. It's also the appearance of the cause of the suffering. So it's symptomatic and diagnostic at the same time. It's also prognostic. This is all like medical terminology. What's the prognosis, doctor? Where is this going? All right. So in that sense, the symptom diagnoses itself, but also points beyond itself. It has a prognostical value. Points beyond itself. Points to, again, the potential for transformation. Points beyond itself. So how? How do we know this about appearances? This is where the immanent and dialectical character come in. So when approaching or trying to process a phenomenon, first of all, we're doing so from within. Meaning we're not outside the phenomenon, but the phenomenon is part of us, we're part of the phenomenon. Right, so the way things appear to us tell us something not about the thing, but about us. Right, so within the terms of the phenomenon, within the parameters of the phenomenon, from within the phenomenon, dialectically. So we're exploring conditions of possibility for a transformation indicated by the phenomenon according to the contradictory character of the phenomenon, according to the way the phenomenon exhibits contradiction. but exhibits, again, imminently self-contradiction. Right? So it's not a perspective from outside. It's not a contradiction from outside. It's not an external perspective, nor is it an external contradiction. It's an internal perspective on an internal contradiction, a self-contradiction. So I mentioned when we did the dialectic of being and becoming that we have a term here from Nietzsche that we're going to encounter later, namely starting next week, that this dialectic of being and becoming gives us a task, but it also gives us a process of prognosis of self-overcoming. So that Selbstaufhebung, self-sublation, taking oneself up, self-overcoming. And that has a contradictory character to it, meaning a process of self-overcoming is a process of both self-fulfillment and self-negation, and a process of self-completion and self-transcendence. Finally, self-realization, self-abolition. And even though Nietzsche is going to frame it, characterize it as psychological, so that it can be seen from the standpoint of the individual, it can be personalized in some way, that we are dealing with impersonal phenomena, impersonal processes. So we're dealing with, for instance, art, capital A art. How does art move historically? It moves through a process of self-contradiction and through a process of self-overcoming. When and how, we're going to see. All right, so this is what Hegel's going to try to do. Little asterisk footnote I'm just going to introduce here, which we'll get to, starting with Nietzsche in a more obscure way, more explicitly with Adorno at the end of the course, that maybe this dialectical movement is not about all of history, but really about modern history. It's really about the modern world. Right, so for Hegel, retrospectively at least, it goes all the way back. This process of self-overcoming, moving through contradiction. So, but in the modernist period, right, so if we think about modernism, but starting with romanticism, because in many ways modernism is a continuation of romanticism, just with the values inverted, so that what is first registering as a loss is turned into a gain. But in the modernist era, we can see how art continues, keeps itself going by negating itself, and negating itself radically. So Pippin also mentioned that in the first week's readings. So how long can art be about itself? How long can art be about the end of itself, the end of art? How long can art history be informed by a process of self-negation? Well, as long as we're in this society, according to Pippin. And he leaves it unspecified, what isn't and what is. I mentioned this is like hyper, euphemistic or coded. It's Marxism. It's what isn't and what is. It's the communism that isn't in the capitalism that is. That's what all of this is about, right? The left Hegelian, Marxist, Frankfurt School, blah, 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 right? Pippin. But also Susan Buckmorse, who was educated in the Frankfurt School as well. Hamza Walker, more getting it just ambiently as a member of my generation. And growing up in Baltimore in a John Waters movie, it's an angry punk full of rage who loves alienation. Anyway, so when thinking about this rather than self in the sense of a personal self or an individual self, thinking about it in terms of a phenomenon, right? So again, socialism or communism would be the Selbstaufhebung, the self-overcoming of capitalism. That's Marx. Now, Hegel wasn't really concerned with that because he's living before the effect of capitalism is really registering. We'll get to that later. So he's looking at it more retrospectively. He's looking at it in terms of how we understand history, how we understand the history of art. How we understand the history of art such that art could have come to the present moment it's in his own time. Again, Romanticism. I think that I mentioned this last time. When Hegel says romantic, he means modern. It means his time. And we can say that what Hegel is saying about his romantic moment might still be the case for us in a modernist and postmodernist and post-postmodernist moment. All right, so let me get back to this point about essence must appear. It's to get over the traditional philosophical, the ancient philosophical distinction of appearance and essence. Right, so if you recall from Pippin again, without the traditional essence-appearance distinction, where the essence is true but the appearance is false, rather, no, the appearance is true. The appearance is true. So it's not like a true essence that we get a false appearance of. No, the appearance is true. All right. And then finally, the phases of the appearance of freedom, which can come in different order. So depending on the purposes of the argument. So for Hegel, in one respect, we'll see in another respect it's different, but for Nietzsche, it is religion is the first form of appearance. It's the first appearance of Geist. It's the first appearance of mind, consciousness. It's the first appearance of freedom. The first appearance of freedom is religion. It's the first cultural form. It's the first artificial form. It's the thing that we have that the animals don't have. They don't have religion. We have religion. So it's the first appearance of freedom. And then you have, so that's a moral system. That's a kind of practical moral universe. That's what religion is. It's not just a belief. It's a practical moral universe that we inhabit. And then you have what we might call one key phase in the secularization or the humanization of what appears in religion, and that's in art. So next time we'll see how tragedy as a dramatic art form emerges from a religious ritual. The Dionysian, the satyr play, the Dionysian ritual, which then becomes the satyr play, which then becomes tragedy. Right, so you could also call it a step of, or a phase of enlightenment, that the first way in which we're enlightened is through religion. Then we gain a further enlightenment or a further self-consciousness through art. And then finally, for Hegel, the highest stage of self-consciousness, of the appearance of freedom and of enlightenment, comes through philosophy. But this isn't just something that we do in our heads, it's something that we're actually doing in reality. So the first community is a religious community. And then that community becomes more self-conscious when it becomes an artistic community. And then finally, it becomes most self-conscious when it becomes a philosophical community. And that's what Hegel thinks the modern world is. In other words, we're not held together, our community is not established by religion, by a common practical moral universe of values, nor is it a community of shared aesthetic sensibility, a community of art. Understood broadly, by the way, like everything is art. Architecture is art. Everything has an artistic dimension to it. Art in the raw sense of the term, right? Any human created thing is a work of art in that sense. but looked at in its aesthetic character, right? So we don't share that sensibility. We're not a community united by aesthetic sensibility, which is one more level of abstraction, we can say, from the community of common, practical, moral sensibility. That a community held together by aesthetic sensibility is a more abstract community than a religious community. And then finally, a community that is philosophical in character is even more abstract. So we will also see that the ancient world for Nietzsche takes that step. So the Dionysian ritual becomes the satyr play, becomes the tragic drama, which then is interpreted by Aristotle, a philosopher, and that's the death of tragedy. That's the death of the aesthetic community and its replacement by a philosophical community. So these phases of history, they're phases, not periods, because they actually recur. There are cycles that go on. So European civilization, as opposed to the civilization of the ancient Greeks, and then the Romans go through something similar. The Romans go through their own cycle of phases. But European culture and civilization itself, so if we call it Western civilization, European civilization, what is no longer the civilization or the world of the ancient Mediterranean milieu, the Greeks and the Romans. So what is Western or European civilization? It's German, we'll see. It's German civilization. So it's the Middle Ages. It's the Holy Roman Empire. It's the medieval era, which is religious. Right? So after the fall of the Roman Empire, you go back to a religious community rather than a philosophical community of late antiquity. And then the Renaissance. Right? The first step out of religion to a secular, more humanistic, and more self-conscious community is an aesthetic one, the Renaissance. The early modern era. And then finally, we get to the philosophical era of the Enlightenment, of the 1600s and 1700s, which Hegel is coming at the end of. Right, so the idea is that we've graduated. We also have a more abstract and secular form of Christianity, Protestantism. Right, the transformation of Christianity after the Renaissance. Not merely the transformation of Christianity, but the revolutionizing of Christianity. It takes over 100 years of religious wars in which millions of people die to affect that change in Christianity, which also affects Catholicism as well. So the Roman Church is also transformed in this way. And religion becomes more philosophical. So not only art, but religion is transcended philosophically. You get more philosophical theology in the Protestant Reformation that is building on the roots of late medieval theology, which takes an infusion of Plato and Aristotle from the classical world. If you guys know your theology at all? No? Late Middle Ages? No? Yeah. So they bring in Plato and Aristotle to prop up Christianity. And then Plato and Aristotle become Christians before Christ. That's how they square the circle. They're like, wait, how could these pagan ancient philosophers be right? Oh, well, they actually were Christian because Jesus occurs outside of time and space, and so they got the word of Jesus before Jesus was born. Why not? Of course Jesus is outside of time and space. Jesus is way cool. Of course he transcends space and time. How could he not? He was always intended. Right? We just had to wait. Sorry, children. It's Hegel. He's a German. Protestant. Christianity. Europe. The West. Right? Slightly different than what we've been dealing with so far with Kant and
Because
Schiller. Patty?
the Renaissance, or at least like with painting and sculpture, is so much in Italy. Do you think that it's because
Northern Renaissance, Rembrandt. Come on, go ahead.
well, I don't
No, say it though.
well, I
Finish
guess,
the
like,
thought.
because all of the, not all, but most of the major philosophy that is German, is it because there is, do you think, more of the, because of the Protestant Reformation, that all of the philosophy was, 'cause in Italy they were saying Catholic mostly, right?
Yeah, I mean, how Catholic I mean, maybe they were very Catholic, the Medicis and the Borgias. Maybe they're like super Catholic because they're so mafia, they're so gangsta. But maybe that is Catholicism. I'm sure MS-13 is quite Catholic.
But like, is that,
All the tattoos, they're all Catholic. Anyway.
the Reformation is what is like the start of philosophy in the modern way. That's not religious.
Right. So that would be Hegel's view. That would be Hegel's view. That again, one of the things we have to think about with respect to transformation is continuity and change. Continuity and change. So there is a change, but it's based on something that came before. It's not out of nowhere. Right. So there's a kind of a layering of history. There are different threads that come together in this historical process that appear to be in contradiction to each other, but then ultimately reverse themselves and combine. And it's not, by the way, I have to put this out of account straight away. So it's not thesis, antithesis, synthesis. That's like the cheesy version of Hegelian dialectics. It's actually not that, because that's a little bit too linear. Right, so it's actually more self-contradictory than that can account for. It's more self-contradictory and more recursive than a thesis, antithesis, synthesis picture would give you. So just keep that in mind, because I guess if you like Google it or Wikipedia, you might get your thesis, antithesis, synthesis. They're pretty much up to speed though. All the Maoists who are doing Wikipedia told you they canceled me. Did I tell you that? Yeah, that's why I don't have a Wikipedia page, because the Maoists are trying to stop the revolution. They are trying to stop the revolution. So they're trying to stop me. They're a little bit more sophisticated than that. The Wikipedia entries are a little bit more sophisticated. They will say, oh, well, Lenin said it's not a wooden trichotomy of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Okay, good, God bless children. Okay, so indeed, Maddie, that is the point, right? And so even the fact that religion might come back after the Renaissance, right? Because you get, the Puritanism of Protestantism would appear to be a reversal of the Renaissance. So, because I'm giving you this European history, especially Western history, and this German version of European history, I can't fail but to mention something that you guys will read later with Nietzsche. Nietzsche says that the Germans are responsible for bringing about an end to all the great flowerings of European civilization. So the German, the tribes, wrecked the Roman Empire, the Vandals, but also the Holy Roman Empire is a great step down from the Roman Empire. So the Germans are responsible for the end of the classical world. And then the Germans are responsible for the end of the Renaissance with the Protestant Reformation. Right? The Protestant Reformation is like a counter-revolution against the Renaissance. And then finally, German idealism, Kant and Schiller and Hegel, bring an end to the Enlightenment. So the Germans wreck the Enlightenment with Kant, Schiller, and Hegel, according to Nietzsche. So the Germans are responsible for wrecking all great flowerings of European civilization. Something to keep in mind. That's his little rebuttal to what we're doing. But then we'll see how actually he might agree with Kant, Schiller, and Hegel anyway, even though he says that he doesn't. But he might anyway, in the end. So there might be a little bit more of a tortured relationship there than his little quips can express. But these reversals, so Maddie, the point being that the reversals are important to bear in mind. Right? It's not a smooth linear process. That's why it's not periods but phases. Now, of course, he's got another way of thinking about it, which is art-religion philosophy. Art-religion philosophy would mean that first we're dealing with aesthetic appearances, then we're dealing with their divine meaning. In other words, religion would be a step forward in self-consciousness of freedom in comparison to art, which again would be more spontaneous and seemingly natural in character. So religion and theology especially would be considered a greater self-consciousness than is available through aesthetic appearance in art. And then philosophy would be the next step of self-consciousness out of theology. So that's another way of thinking about it as well. And that's the one that he's going to lean on more here. And that would help address exactly what you're raising, Maddie. So, in other words, the Renaissance is a kind of rebirth of self-consciousness, but in artistic form, that then must necessarily have been followed by a theological form, namely Protestantism, and then finally yielded to a philosophical form in the Enlightenment. All right, so there's another way of thinking about that progress of self-consciousness in a greater degree of abstraction. That religion is more abstract than art, and philosophy is more abstract than religion. But especially theology is more abstract than art, and philosophy is more abstract than theology. So, on the philosophical point, the idea is that in Hegel's own time, and this is what's being registered by the Romantics, it's becoming clear that thinking of society in religious terms and thinking of society in artistic terms is inadequate, it's insufficient in terms of self-consciousness. That we must necessarily graduate to a philosophical self-consciousness because the community we live in is philosophical. It's not religious or artistic, but philosophical. It's more abstract. And he thinks that Kant and Schiller were not clear on this. And that Schiller especially might have fumbled the ball a bit with his idea that art is the answer to the question and problem of consciousness of freedom, the play drive. Right, so Hegel in his own time, he's coming after Kant and Schiller, and also after the French Revolution, and after the Enlightenment, after the long period of bourgeois revolution coming out of the Renaissance, the Protestant Reformation, and all the political upheavals that took place, that maybe we had to go through all these mistakes before we could get to the adequate self-consciousness. Even though those mistakes were necessary, in other words, they weren't just trial and error mistakes, they were motivated, they were necessary, they were meaningful, but that he does think that he's living in a time where humanity has arrived at an adequate self-consciousness of itself and also of its tasks. And that would be registered in philosophy because it would be expressing what is essentially a philosophical world. Now, did we talk, I don't think that we talked about this. This is going to be important. It's sort of not stated as such in Hegel, but it's going to be important as we move ahead. Did we talk about social relations? We did not talk about social relations. Okay. So, because we're dealing with religion, art, and philosophy, or art, religion, and philosophy, we're dealing with forms of appearance. We're also dealing with social relations, so the community. So social relations. Could also say community. So relations to or with, not just between people, so not just relations to other people, but also relation to and with nature. Nature in this sense. Nature in the sense of everything that exists. Everything that is. So concepts of nature from Kant. Everything that exists, the given world, the world that we're born into, the natural world. Including physical and biological nature, but more than that. History and culture as well. Everything that exists and that has come into existence historically. And finally, it's our relation to and relation with ourselves. So it's relation to others, relation to nature, and relation to oneself. So it's a cosmology. It's a cosmology, or it's a cosmos. It's a universe.
When you mention nature, does it include, you mentioned the things, everything that happens historically. So where does time lie in this social relation? Does it count as nature?
Time
Or
is
not?
tricky. So this week, in addition to teaching this class, I'm also advising the teaching of another text by Hegel, coincidentally. Good for me in terms of my own tasks this week. His Introduction to the Philosophy of History. So these are the introductory lectures on aesthetics. But the Introduction to the Philosophy of History. And what he says there very explicitly is time is not really part of history. So there's a difference between time and history. So what that means is that the relevance of something in the past is not determined by its temporal proximity. So something that happened a long time ago can be more relevant than something that happened yesterday. Right. That's one way in which time doesn't matter.
Can you say that again? The sentence that
The relevance or pertinence of something in the past for the present is not determined by its proximity in time. So something longer ago, further in the past, can be more relevant than something that's more recent. Right. So he says, with history, one is concerned with what is eternally present in the past, because one is dealing with how the past is present.
The experience of time of the individual.
And he also, we can get into that. We'll get into finitude and infinitude at the subjective level. But he also says, as far as history is concerned, duration has no place in it. So something can be significant if it's longer ago, but also if it didn't last very long. So something that happened that's very brief can still be profound. And something that lasted a long time can be pretty much irrelevant. So duration has no place in it. All right, so again, not a linear conception of historical meaning or relevance. So what's eternally present in the past, in which duration has no place in it. Okay. Now, in terms of our experience of time, there's our experience of time, and then there's our experience of time. Meaning, of course, we are finite creatures who live in time. We didn't talk about this with Kant, but let me just make mention of this, because Kant's sort of famous for this. You know, we get these little axioms from philosophers, and, you know, people just sort of crack their heads on these things and think that that's what, you know, the essence of a philosopher is. Space and time are essential categories. That's a little episteme of Kant's. It's from the Critique of Pure Reason, which is pretty much the only thing that people pretend to have read. Nobody even reads that, of course. They don't read what we read. I told you guys that, right? So nobody reads the Critique of Judgment. So they pretend to read the Critique of Pure Reason, and then he's like, okay, space and time. Okay, so, but space and time not as psychological categories. Not as psychological categories, but actually as practical categories. In other words, what are space and time essentially, and why are they necessary conditions for any categories of our subjectivity?
This gives a context or a container.
Well, it not only does that, but it projects. In other words, it's not like you have to establish space and time. It's rather, everything that we do projects space and time. So space and time are projections of actions. So what space is and what time is derives from our practical action. That's why the quality of space and time can change historically. So like the true, the good, and the beautiful, like the faculties of understanding, practical reason, and judgment, they're universal across cultures, across historical time, and yet they change, right? So every culture, every community cannot do without notions of the true, the good, and the beautiful, nor can they do without notions of space and time. And yet, what the true, the good, and the beautiful, and what space and time are, can radically change across cultures and across history. Right, so our experience of the true, the good, and the beautiful, our experience of space and time change because our practices change, our actions change, and not just individually, but collectively. Right? So in that sense, of course, it is a context, meaning we're all born into society. I mentioned Kant's a Rousseauian, as are Schiller and Hegel, meaning that whatever human beings might have been naturally as biological organisms, that's antediluvian, that's the Garden of Eden, that's someplace else. It's outside of space and time as far as we're concerned. It's outside of history as far as we're concerned. We have no way of really knowing what that is. We only know ourselves in society. Because society is the source of our reflection, of our...
Why is it universe rather than society? Like,
Oh, well, here's a little, I'll use a sociologist from the late 19th or early 20th century who has a lot of parallels to Hegel, and that's Emil Durkheim. So he says, of course, commonsensically we think that society takes place within nature. In other words, society is just like a group of humans taking place within a physical, natural universe. But in fact, he says, no, society doesn't take place within nature, but nature takes place within society. Meaning what nature is, or in relation to it, takes place within society. And what that means is that the universe takes place within society. In other words, whatever, what is it that Kant called it? The sensuous manifold, basically the eternal flux of matter and energy, right? Did I mention this to you guys? Did we? Everything Everywhere All at Once?
yeah.
I think I must have mentioned that. Yeah, Everything Everywhere All at Once. I love to use this because Einstein said, what philosophers call time, physicists know doesn't really exist. Meaning everything that's ever going to happen has already happened, right? It's Einstein's world, we're just living in it. No, it's Hegel's world and we're just living in it. It's Marx's world, we're just living in it. But anyway, as Foucault said, we're living through a dream of Hegel's. Heidegger also said something similar. But just when we think that we've awoken from the dream of Hegel, it turns out we're still in the dream. All right. No, we're still in society. That's all that means. right? And we have always been, right? So in that sense, the universe, there isn't like a universe. There's just stuff. There's just stuff. There's just stuff, right? It's only from our subjective standpoint that there's a universe. Otherwise, there's just stuff, and it already happened. Meaning, the universe exists, it doesn't exist. You know, where are we? We're in the universe, but the universe didn't exist, and then it exists, and then one day it won't exist.
There's no exact coordinates.
I mean, the reason of putting it that way, by the way, is just to say that our very conception of the universe is going to radically change. It has radically changed, and it will radically change. So whatever theory we have now, the Big Bang, origin of the universe, the Big Bang, Big Crunch, right? Is the universe expanding? Is it contracting? When did that happen? When did it reverse from expanding to contracting? A couple of decades ago. But no, it didn't change direction. Our conception of it changed. All right, so what the universe is for us what it is. What it is in itself, who knows? God knows. Right? It really isn't at all.
That go almost contradicts to Hegel's concept of truth, though.
Ah.
Because well, I know there are certain cases where it's projection or how we approach them, how we perceive them. But when we talk about appearances, at least I would assume that we want to know what it is as itself. Does it make sense?
Of course we want to know what the truth is.
Yeah.
But what if the truth is not out there, but in us?
Mm-hmm.
Right? What if there's just data, there's sense data perception, there's factoids, facts, stuff, data, but how do we relate to it? What does it mean? What is its significance? And also, how can it change?
It's very humanistic.
It is.
Very
Speciesism, total.
Human-centric.
It is absolutely, completely anthropocentric. The reason for that is that we can't communicate with the animals. We can't really have a community with the animals other than in some sock puppet kind of way. Despite the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, when the dolphins take off into space before the aliens smash the Earth to make room for a cosmic superhighway. No, you guys know is it Douglas Adams? Who's the author? Who's the author of Hitchhiker's Guide? Come on, nerds. No? All the historical references are disappearing. Space and time is collapsing. The everything bagel has been eaten. All that is solid melts into air. Well, that sounds nice. I more think it's like total collapse, right? Cosmic collapse. Because all that solid melts into air, sort of like, So there's some hope there, right? No, I'm talking about complete, total...
Chaos.
Chaos also sounds good. I mean, like, total nullity, like nihilism. You said delusion?
Implosion.
Implosion, absolutely implosion. Whoosh, big crunch. Anyway, so we're going to change our conception of the universe. Guaranteed. We're going to all of our scientific truth that we have now, it will be radically revised, and in the future people will look back and say, "Oh, remember when people believed in atoms? Because atoms don't exist, right? Quantum mechanics, right? Remember when they thought that these things existed? No.
Why do you feel like you're waiting for that time? You're almost anticipating.
I am personally. No, I'm not. No. I'm waiting for this to happen. I'm waiting for the self-Aufhebung of capitalism. Let's do this. Socialism, children. Let's make it happen. Okay? That's what we want. We don't want the big crunch now. All right, sorry. All right, but the point being, the community, the cosmology, the cosmos, the social relations were religious. in character, but now what Hegel is saying is that they're philosophical in character. So what does that mean? It means not mediated through moral practices, but mediated through concepts. And also not mediated through aesthetic appearances. Or at least not mediated through aesthetic appearances alone, but mediated through aesthetic appearances and also through moral practices and also through philosophical concepts. Right, so these phases of appearance, it's not that religion doesn't go away. Religion is transformed. Art doesn't go away, it's transformed. Right, so it's not like one is replaced by the other exactly, it's that you have a kind of greater self-conscious of what was before and what continues. So it does continue. So we are still what we were as hunter-gatherers. We are still essentially a practical moral community. We are still essentially a religious community. But that religious community has become internally differentiated and has elaborated itself into other domains. And it has realized itself, as well as negated itself, through the emergence of art and philosophy out of religion. So all these things occur. Again, it's not linear. It's recursive. It's elaborating in its character. All right, so, because he's got a lot to say about primitive and ancient peoples, historical communities, about the way things appeared to them, and it's just important to keep in mind the stakes of all of that, right? Because he moves through it pretty cursorily sometimes, right? And he is living through a time, I'll just say, of, this will be important when we get to Nietzsche next time. So, it's at the tail end of the Enlightenment. There is a kind of explosion of academic, like a proliferation of academic disciplines in Hegel's time. So philosophy is becoming more rigorous as an academic discipline, but then you have new academic disciplines, new ways of thinking about things and understanding things like anthropology, archaeology, scriptural exegesis, theology. These are becoming more rigorous disciplines, more formal disciplines than they were before. And science itself, which started out, the scientific revolution is just some, idiosyncratic bourgeois cranks, and then it becomes much more of a formal, disciplined practice. And this is happening in Hegel's time. So all of that would be understood as philosophical. In other words, science is becoming more philosophical, art and literature are becoming more philosophical, more self-disciplined, more rigorous, more self-conscious, and therefore more philosophical. And I always like to joke about academia, that everybody has a doctor of philosophy. It doesn't matter what you're studying, right? So you can have a doctor of philosophy in physics, or you can have a doctor of philosophy in English literature. What that means is that they're all supposed to be scientific. That's what it means to be a doctor of philosophy. It means to be a scientist. So somehow, what we're doing here at SAIC is meant to be scientific. And what does that mean? There's a term that Hegel has that's not just unique to him, but it's important to bear in mind with him. It's Wissenschaft. So it's a more capacious term than, again, the English connotation of science would be the physical sciences, the natural sciences, or the exact sciences. Well, no, we have the human sciences, we have the social sciences, we have the humanities, right? The humanistic sciences. We have a science of art. We approach art scientifically. Right? What does that mean? For Hegel, it means philosophically, and actually what Wissenschaft means is, this is not on our chart here, but if you go back to Kant, conditions of possibility, it is, right? Conditions of possibility. So we have disciplines, we have practices, we have ways of knowing that are supposedly aware of their own conditions of possibility. So we don't just do them, but we reflect on what makes them possible. So they have a high degree of self-reflection, self-reflexivity, an ability to justify themselves, and that's what it means for them to be scientific. And Hegel is trying to do scientific philosophy, right? He's not like a pre-Socratic ancient Greek mystic, like Heraclitus or Parmenides. Like he's not like just taking some shrooms and then like uttering some poetry and people are writing it down, because that's how philosophy started. It's also how science started. No, it's more self-aware, self-reflexive, self-critical. Right, so all of that would be scientific, and in Hegel's language would also be philosophic. Right, so in modern society, we have to justify everything that we do with reason. Right, we proceed in all domains, we proceed scientifically, which for Hegel means philosophically. Art is practiced scientifically. And again, that's what we come back to, the necessity of criticism, theory, philosophy, art history. Right, so my department, the department that this course is in, is the Department of Art History, Theory, and Criticism. Oh, okay. Right, because that's all that's necessary in order to be scientific about it. And what that means is that artists and the viewer, the producer, and the consumer or receiver of art needs scientific self-awareness, needs philosophy, needs criticism, history, theory, philosophy. You need to know critical discourse around art historical discourse. It's more discursive, it's more conceptual. Right? These things are necessary. Which again, the romantics are like, oh, that means art's over. It means that we're just talking about art, we're not doing art. That should sound familiar to us. Right? And Hegel's like, well, no, we're still doing art, but we're also talking about it. We need both. Right? So art has become self-conscious through these disciplines that seem external to it, but are actually internal to it. Right? That artistic practice has evolved such that it actually needs that kind of more discursive reflection in order to be itself. That sounds very optimistic. That's super optimistic on Hegel's part. We might be like the Romantics and be like, yeah, no, people are just talking about art, they're not actually doing it. That might resonate with us more strongly than Hegel's like, hey, no, we're doing it. We're talking about it, but we're still doing it. We might be more pessimistic about that. All right, so I want to look at the first section of the text. What are we doing for time? Let's see. All right, so just where he starts off, I want to take note of some things. So you'll notice that with Kant and Schiller, it was the aesthetic, or his aesthetical judgment. It was the aesthetic education of man. Now, though, and Schiller, by the way, was a bridge between Kant and Hegel on this. What does he say? These lectures are devoted to aesthetics. Their topic is the spacious realm of the beautiful. More precisely, their province is art, or rather, fine art. So notice how he moves that way. So aesthetics is the broadest category. The beautiful is a subset. Art is a subset of the beautiful, and then fine art is a subset of art. So everything is art. This table is art. This demonic device is art. This chair is art. This room is art. This building is art. But it's not fine art. Why is it not fine art? Well, because applied art. Applied art, not fine art. Right, so fine art. So the chair is a work of art, but it doesn't exist for its sake as an artwork. It exists so I can sit my ass down. That's why it exists. Right. A fine artwork exists for its own sake, as an aesthetic object. Right. So fine art. For this topic, it is true the word aesthetics, taken literally, is not wholly satisfactory, since aesthetics means more precisely the science of sensation and of feeling. In this sense, it had its origin as a new science, or rather as something which for the first time was to become a philosophical discipline. In the school of Wolff, at the period in Germany when works of art were treated with regard to the feelings they were supposed to produce, as, for instance, the feeling of pleasure, admiration, fear, pity, and so on. Because of the unsatisfactoriness, or more accurately, the superficiality of this word, attempts were made, after all, to frame others, calistics, for example. But this too appears inadequate because the science which is meant deals not with the beautiful as such, but simply with the beauty of art. We will therefore let the word aesthetics stand. As a mere name, it is a matter of indifference to us, and besides, it has meanwhile passed over into common speech. So when people say aesthetics now, they do tend to think of art. As a name, then, it may be retained, but the proper expression for our science is philosophy of art, and more definitely, philosophy of fine art. By adopting this expression, we at once exclude the beauty of nature. Oof. Such a limitation of our topic may appear to be laid down arbitrarily on the principle that every science has authority to demarcate its scope at will. But this is not the sense in which we should take the limitation of aesthetics to the beauty of art. Whereas it's not just we're narrowing our focus. In ordinary life, we're of course accustomed to speak of a beautiful color, a beautiful sky, a beautiful river, likewise of beautiful flowers, beautiful animals, and even more of beautiful people. We will not here enter upon the controversy about how far the attribute of beauty is justifiably ascribed to these and the like, and how far in general natural beauty may be put alongside the beauty of art. But we may assert against this view, even at this stage, that the beauty of art is higher than nature. So again, if art were the imitation of nature, that would suggest that art is inferior to nature. And he's saying, no, art is superior to nature. The beauty of art is beauty born of the spirit and born again. Geist. And the higher the spirit and its productions stand above nature and its phenomena, the higher too is the beauty of art above that of nature. Indeed, considered formally, i.e. no matter what it says, even a useless notion that enters a man's head is higher than any product of nature. Because in such a notion, spirituality and freedom are always present. So the most useless notion that enters your head, children, is higher than the sun, or the solar system, or the galaxy, or the physical universe itself. Because it's an expression of freedom in a way that the earth, the sun, are not. Otherwise, we're just miserable apes.
But the audacity to consider that, I don't know. I feel like a lot of, that's why I was talking about why is this so human-centric?
Yeah, why do we reject that then?
But why do we think that we're so important?
Well, Because we are. Also, we're asking the question.
I know, I think.
The Earth never says, why am I important?
True. But the sun does its job, you know? It's
Sun doesn't do shit.
I know.
It just melts
There are
down.
like a lot of these, I guess this is my personal projection onto it. So.
But why don't we like this arrogant human because we think it goes against God?
Or against
That's the only choice, huh?
or against other humans.
Other humans? Humans. There's the humans question. And then remember what Kant said, intelligent beings.
There's a hierarchy.
There is.
Yeah, I think it's just, even though they didn't present themselves in these writings or essays, theories, there's no, they consider humanity as a collective, as a whole, but there are certain hierarchy hidden, suggested within.
Well, there's a historical hierarchy, that's for sure, that the present is higher than the past. At least for these guys, for Kant, Schiller, and Hegel. Today, I don't know. 2024, not so sure.
Yeah,
We-
it's the same thing when.
We seem to be lower than Hegel. Because we can't acknowledge simply that the most stupid thought in a person's head is higher than nature.
And we're not talking about art, we're describing it.
What do you mean? What's the difference there?
I was talking with the action interacting. I feel like a lot of these language or writings are simply describing it instead of.
That's right. When have you last read a article about anything, pop song, a movie, that actually made a judgment, that actually dared to make a judgment? That isn't just cataloging it on the menu of choices for the consumer. That's not just telling you what niche market it fits into. That's not just describing it. But that's trying to get at its truth.
Or at least there's an attempt for the truth.
There is. I read an article, Eileen Jones, writing for Jacobin, my favorite knot. Do you guys know this? Democratic Socialists of America, their journal. Started by someone who I did have an impact on, but not a good enough impact, evidently. But their House film critic wrote an article about Megalopolis. Has anyone seen Megalopolis?
Not yet.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm probably not gonna know. No, it's new. It's Francis Ford Coppola. It's like one of these guys. It's like the last death rattle. And so she said it was shit, right? She passed a judgment, but she couldn't say that without saying, you know what, all of cinema now is shit. Which means it's not really a judgment,
Yeah.
right? It's more like throwing up your hands. It's like, oh, like we might expect Francis Ford Coppola to save us from the shit that cinema has become, but no, he can't, right? So that's a little deranged in terms of like a judgment, right? Because it's not saying film should be this and not that. It's just saying film is all shit now. All right. So even that, like, so it made a judgment, but not much of a substantial judgment. Right? It's just like, oh, we go to see this movie to get a break from the Marvel universe. Right? But then we find that it's still the fucking Marvel universe. It's just done by this old filmmaker whose best years are behind him. Yep.
Have you read the Manhattan Art Review?
I
No.
was thinking about that. He just posted it and said.
Was this new?
Well, yeah, so it's this guy who lives in New York and he reviews art shows and gives them like a star rating out of 5. And he's just like his honest opinion about
I
whether
got
it's
his
any good.
book for last year. I didn't.
What's his name?
Sean something.
I don't.
Recent publication though, right? Like he
He
started
started
something.
in 2019, I think.
Yeah,
It's
so
really
recent.
entertaining.
It's entertaining.
It's really
What's it called?
entertaining. The Manhattan Art Review.
I think some of them are very personal. I think he has a.
He definitely has bias.
Yeah, he has faces. That's the thing. I feel like some of the reviews are very like critical and good, but then some, he's going through some shit in his personal life and it shows.
Oh, he's just venting.
But he should get the collection from last year.
Right, because judgment should not be based on mood. Should be more objective.
But isn't that creativity, that flow of creativity comes, yeah.
All right, so anyway, that was like a major digression, but that's fine because we need to establish that considered in its content, the sun, for example, appears as an absolutely necessary factor in the universe, while a false notion vanishes as accidental and transitory. But taken by itself, a natural existent like the sun is indifferent, not free and self-conscious in itself. And if we treat it in its necessary connection with other things, then we are not treating it by itself, and therefore not as beautiful. Right, so that's another Kantian point, which is that the sun is just a physical phenomenon within a physical universe. There is no autonomy, self-legislation, there's no self-determination of the sun in the way that there is for the artwork. Meaning, the sun never transcends its context, but the artwork, by definition, has to. In other words, that the artwork is not reducible to its contextual conditions, to its background conditions. So remember the chart on the last page of the introduction to the Critique of Judgment by Kant? The unity of the conditioned and its conditions in which it transcends its conditions. Right, so the useless notion in a person's head transcends the physical organism of the Homo sapiens in a way that the sun never does. Now, if we said in general that spirit and its artistic beauty stands higher than natural beauty, then of course virtually nothing is settled, because higher is quite a vague expression which describes natural and artistic beauty as still standing side by side in the space of imagination, and differing only quantitatively and therefore externally. But what is higher about the spirit and its artistic beauty is not something merely relative in comparison to nature. On the contrary, spirit is alone the true, comprehending everything in itself, so that everything beautiful is truly beautiful only as sharing in this higher sphere and generated by it. In this sense, the beauty of nature appears only as a reflection of the beauty that belongs to spirit, as an imperfect, incomplete mode of beauty, a mode which in its substance is contained in the spirit itself. So besides, we shall find that a limitation to fine art arises very naturally, since however much is said about the beauties of nature, less by the ancients than by us, it has not yet entered anyone's head to concentrate on the beauty of natural objects and make a science a systematic exposition of these beauties. A treatment from the point of view of utility has indeed been made, and for example, a scientific account of natural objects useful against diseases has been composed. A materia medica, a description of the minerals, chemical products, plants, or animals, which are useful for cures. But the realms of nature have not been classified and examined from the point of view of beauty. In discussing natural beauty, we feel ourselves too much in a vague sphere without a criterion, and therefore such a classification would provide too little interest for us to undertake it. These preliminary remarks on beauty in nature and art, on the relation of the two, and the exclusion of the former from the scope of our proper subject, should dispose of the idea that the limitation is due merely to caprice and arbitrariness. The proof of this relation should not come here yet, since its consideration falls within our science itself, and is therefore not to be further explained and proved until later. But if we now limit ourselves provisionally to the beauty of art, this first step brings us at once up against new difficulties. The first that we may encounter is the doubt whether fine art shows itself deserving of a scientific treatment. Whether the beauty of fine art, whether fine art with respect to its beauty. Beauty in art does indeed pervade all the business of life like a friendly genius, and brightly adorns all our surroundings, whether inner or outer, mitigating the seriousness of our circumstances and the complexities of the actual world, extinguishing idleness in an entertaining way, and where there is nothing good to be done, filling the place of evil, always better than evil itself. Yet even though art intersperses with its pleasing forms everything from the war paint of the savages to the splendor of temples, with all their riches of adornment, these forms themselves nevertheless seem to fall outside the true ends and aims of life. Even if artistic creations are not detrimental to these serious purposes, if indeed they sometimes seem to further them, at least by keeping evil away, still art belongs rather to the indulgence and relaxation of the spirit, whereas substantial interests require its exertion. So we can look at primitive peoples adorning themselves with war paint, but we should remember that it's war paint. In other words, it's not meant to be looked at as beauty. It's meant to help, like, the warrior achieve his aims, kill his enemies, by visually dazzling his enemies. Right? It's not a work of art. We can regard it as a work of art, but it has a utility. Right? It's war paint. Just like a beautiful animal is beautiful to us, but why does the flower have the color that it has? Why does the butterfly have the colors it has? Well, for practical purposes. For mating, pollination. Right? It's supposed to have a functional result. Or why predatory animals usually are quite lovely, quite beautiful. They're meant to terrify, bedazzle, transfix their victims. They're not meant to be regarded aesthetically in and of themselves the way only humans can. Right? Similarly, all the aesthetic character of religious environments, like a temple, is bound up with the religious ritual that is practiced there. It's not supposed to be regarded as something beautiful. It's supposed to be awe-inspiring. It's supposed to be the presence of the divine in order to inspire piety and respect. Not meant to be just a pleasurable spectacle. Thus, it may look as if it would be inappropriate and pedantic to propose to treat with scientific seriousness what is not itself of a serious nature. In any case, on this view, art appears as a superfluity, even if the softening of the heart, which preoccupation with beauty can produce, does not altogether become exactly deleterious as downright effeminacy. From this point of view, granted that the fine arts are a luxury, it has frequently been necessary to defend them in their relation to practical necessities in general, and in particular to morality and piety. And since it is impossible to prove their harmlessness, at least to give grounds for believing that this luxury of the spirit may afford a greater sum of advantages than disadvantages. With this in view, serious aims have been ascribed to art itself, and it has frequently been recommended as a mediator between reason and sense, between inclination and duty, as a reconciler of these colliding elements in their grim strife and opposition. Now, by the way, SAIC. Okay, so part of the mission of art, according to this institution, is social justice. But what if it doesn't serve the ends of social justice? What if it's useless from the standpoint of social justice? Would it still be worthy of being made and being enjoyed? Hegel says yes. Right, so we have regressed here. Remember, I did my MFA here in a political activist department, the video department. Did I talk about this? And they objected to my work being too arty. And I said, well, this is the Art Institute, and I am getting a Master of Fine Art, motherfucks. And I'm a Marxist and a leftist before I ever went to school here, and more serious about all that than you all. Right?
Was it the department or is it just a cohort?
It was a department, and then it got absorbed by film, video, new media. It's good that it liquidated, and the professors are no longer here.
Greg?
Hmm?
Was it Greg? Before?
He came later. Yeah, he came later. Greg Mordowitz came later. All right, so, but it may be maintained that in the case of these aims of art, oh, by the way, I'll say something about Clement Greenberg, who was there as just a supplemental upfront reading, that Clement Greenberg said, art has desperately attempted to escape the fate of religion, which is to become therapy.
Hierarchy. There's a set hierarchy.
Yeah, art is higher than therapy. True. Now, let's say that you don't need therapy. We might need therapy, but our need for art might be higher than our need for therapy. In other words, our need for therapy might be much more practical, whereas our need for art might be more spiritual. What does that mean? It means, might point to our higher needs of freedom, whereas therapy might be like to get us through the day in a practical way that has very little to do with freedom. It has very little to do with changing the world.
Yeah, going back to a couple classes when we're doing critique of judgment, there's a part where we're impaired with our faculties. Yeah. And so that's why we rely on the practical ones, because the practical ones are already impaired. So it's impossible to get to the higher spiritual level
Without satisfying that's right. But it may be maintained that in the case of these aims of art, admittedly more serious, nothing is gained for reason and duty by this attempt at mediation. So this is going to be an important point, that the artwork, the fine art, is important as a realm of mediation. Because by their very nature, reason and duty permit of no mixture with anything else. They cannot enter into such a transaction, and they demand the same purity which they have in themselves. Besides, it might be argued, art is not by this means made any worthier of scientific discussion, since it always remains a servant on both sides, between which it is supposed to mediate. And along with the higher aims, it all the same also promotes idleness and frivolity. Indeed, to put it simply, in this service, instead of being an end in itself, it can appear only as a means. So, again, fine art is defined by being an end in itself, rather than merely a means. If finally art is regarded as a means, then there always remains in the form of the means a disadvantageous aspect, namely that even if art subordinates itself to more serious aims, in fact, and produces more serious effects, the means that it uses for this purpose is deception. This is the point that I want to get to before we take a break. The beautiful has its being in pure appearance. But an inherently true end and aim, as is easily recognized, must not be achieved by deception. And even if here and there it may be furthered by this means, this should be only in a limited way. And even in that case, deception will be unable to count as the right means. For the means should correspond to the dignity of the end, and not pure appearance and deception, but only the truth can create the truth. Just as science, too, has to treat the true interests of the spirit in accordance with the true mode of actuality and the true mode of envisaging it. By the way, so actuality is in the sense that we've talked about before, so not merely what exists, but the task, and envisaging it. In these respects, it may look as if fine art is unworthy of scientific treatment because it is alleged it remains only a pleasing play. And even if it pursues more serious ends, it still contradicts their nature. But the allegation proceeds in general, it is only a servant both of that play and of these ends, and alike for the element of its being and the means of its effectiveness, it can avail itself of nothing but deception and pure appearance. But secondly, it is still more likely to seem that even if fine art in general is a proper object of philosophical reflection, it is yet no appropriate topic for strictly scientific treatment, for the beauty of art presents itself to sense, feeling, intuition, imagination. It has a different sphere from thought, and the apprehension of its activity and its products demands an organ other than scientific thinking. Further, it is precisely the freedom of production and configurations that we enjoy in the beauty of art. In the production as well as in the perception of works of art, it seems as if we escape from every fetter of rule and regularity. In place of the strictness of conformity to law and the dark inwardness of thought, we seek peace and enlivenment in the forms of art. We exchange the shadow realm of the idea for bright and vigorous reality. Finally, the source of works of art is the free activity of fancy, which in its imaginations is itself more free than nature is. Art has at its command not only the whole wealth of natural formations in their manifold and variegated appearance, but in addition, the creative imagination has power to launch out beyond them inexhaustibly in productions of its own. In face of this immeasurable fullness of fancy and its free products, it looks as if thought must lose courage to bring them completely before itself, to criticize them, and to arrange them under its universal formula. Science, on the contrary, the objectors admit, has in its form to do with the thinking which abstracts from a mass of details. The result is that on the one hand, imagination with its whim and caprice, the organ, i.e. of artistic activity and enjoyment, remains excluded from science. On the other hand, they say that while art does brighten and vivify the unillumined and withered dryness of the concept, does reconcile its abstractions and its conflict with reality, does enrich the concept with reality, a purely intellectual treatment of art removes this means of enjoyment, destroys it, and carries the concept back to its simplicity without reality and its shadowy abstractness. This is what Schiller was talking about. That science can only know its object by destroying it. Further, in its content, science is occupied with what is inherently necessary. Okay, so this is where it seems like art is superfluous rather than necessary. And then the question is, and yet art is necessary, but it's of a higher necessity than practical utility. If aesthetics leaves natural beauty aside, we have in this respect apparently not only not gained anything, but rather have removed ourselves still further from the necessary. For the very word nature already gives us the idea of necessity and conformity to law. And so if a state of affairs, which it can be hoped, is nearer to scientific treatment and susceptible to it, but in the sphere of the spirit in general, especially in the imagination, what seems, in comparison with nature, to be peculiarly at home is caprice and the absence of law, and this is automatically incapable of any scientific explanation. Okay, I'm going to jump ahead to the deception. So far as concerns the unworthiness of the element of art in general, namely its pure appearance and deceptions, this objection would, of course, have its justification if pure appearance could be claimed as something wrong. But appearance itself is essential to essence. So the essence must appear. Truth would not be truth if it did not show itself and appear. If it were not truth for someone and for itself, as well as for the spirit in general too. Consequently, not pure appearance in general, but only the special kind of appearance in which art gives reality to what is inherently true can be the subject of reproof. If in this connection the pure appearance in which art brings its conceptions into existence is to be described as deception, this reproof first acquires its meaning in comparison with the phenomena of the external world and its immediate materiality, as well as in relation to our own world of feeling, i.e. the inner world of sense. To both these worlds in our life of experience, our own phenomenal life, we are accustomed to ascribe the value and name of actuality, reality, and truth, in contrast to art, which lacks such reality and truth. But it is precisely this whole sphere of the empirical inner and outer world, which is not the world of genuine actuality. On the contrary, we must call it, in a stricter sense than we call art, a pure appearance and a harsher deception. I think in the Penguin edition, it's a crueler deception. So reality is a crueler deception than art. What does that mean? Only beyond the immediacy of feeling and external objects is genuine actuality to be found. Right? So the way the world is a crueler deception.
In recollection?
in our immediate experience of it than the kind of freedom that art expresses. Right? So the art might be a deceptive appearance, but the appearance of the way the world is a crueler deception because we can forget that that's what it is. In other words, our immediate reality is a deception, but we can forget it's a deception. Whereas in the case of art, we never forget that it's a deception. Or we could say, more precisely, with art, we never forget that it's an appearance.
I like how.
Whereas physical reality, we think, oh, this is like not an appearance.
But isn't this argument sort of unreliable? As in, Hegel uses something worse than art as a deception to prove the point? Like, does that make sense?
Well, we have to consider how reality could be a crueler deception. Right? So reality is a crueler deception because it can distract us from the truth. The truth being that we can change it. Right? So we can be so impressed by physical reality that we can forget our freedom. Whereas art, in which we never lose a sense of its appearance, reminds us of our freedom. Physical reality, we can forget our freedom. With art, we can't, supposedly. Or we ought not to, anyway. Children, art is your profession. What a nightmare. Meaning it's a practical activity. How miserable. How sad. Right? So you could be slaving away in your studio and forget that it's all for freedom. Nobody forced you to be an artist. You forced yourself to be an artist.
And just by forcing yourself, does that mean?
You're free. Yeah. Nobody forced you to be an artist. So I mentioned we looked at the Immortal Beloved. We looked at the Ode to Joy from the Beethoven movie Immortal Beloved in class. There's a better film than that, and that's Amadeus about Mozart. Mozart and Beethoven are your classical music people. Classical music begins with Mozart and ends with Beethoven, just like philosophy starts with Kant and ends with Hegel. Very much. Very much. Okay. So Mozart, that Mozart was haunted by this idea that he was not a genius, that he was just a well-trained monkey, because his father made him perform as a child. So he was like a child prodigy, which meant that he was very good at performing. He was very dexterous. He could play instruments very well. And then he spent the rest of his life proving that he wasn't just a well-trained monkey or a particularly talented monkey, but that he was actually creative and a genius, which of course he was. But he was always haunted by the idea, because he had been a child prodigy, namely that he hadn't chosen it. That he was haunted by the fact that actually at no point did he choose to be a musician. And that drove him on in his creation, in his creativity, because he had to prove to himself that no, he wasn't a musician by the force of his father, who was abusive, but in his freedom. All right, let's take a break. Let's resume and turn to the notes that you guys put in the discussion thread. All right, so okay, this actually is good. So this is the notes from both of you?
Yeah.
Okay, so guide us through.
So the main thing, the main thing is that Hegel
Yeah, that's really hard, but I hated the expression. Because the walls are all red and it's a little bit off, but I don't know.
Hey, I have a question, but I can wait till the end if you pass.
Yeah, we've started.
Okay, hurry up. Thanks.
Okay, so the main thing is that he talked about absolute spirit, which is like the truth, and also the ideal, I think. And he says that art is like the manifestation of the spirit and how it shows truth. And it is self-sufficient, permanently moves and develops human consciousness and culture. It is a product of human activity, of like specially gifted spirit. And it's made for humans' apprehension, has an end and aim in itself. And it's the unity of form and content. And the manifestation of the ideal of God to reveal deeper truths.
Oh, let's look at that passage you guys quoted. So this we take to be the general character of the symbolic, classical, and romantic forms of art as the three relations of the idea to its shape in the sphere of art. They consist in the striving for, the attainment, and the transcendence of the ideal as the true idea of beauty. All right, so let's unpack that. So again, art looked at as art, meaning regarding even non-fine art as fine art. So if we start off with religious art, that would be the symbolic. Right, so religious art would be symbolic art, and it's the striving for the ideal as the true idea of beauty. Right, so that would be the intrinsic connection between the good and the beautiful, right, in a religious cosmology. So I'm not sure how much I emphasize this, but when we're looking at the true, the good, and the beautiful in the ancient sense versus the modern sense that Kant addressed them, that in the Kantian sense, they're not only changeable, so they're eternal values and virtues, but they're also non-identical. Right? Whereas for the ancients, the true, the good, and the beautiful are aspects of the same thing. In fact, and again, this would be an analytic distinction, but still a distinction of self-consciousness, to use Hegel's language, of the criteria of the true, the good, and the beautiful are different. They're not the same thing. So for the ancients, the beautiful would be the appearance of the true and the good. Whereas beauty can be a value in itself, or disinterested beauty. If you recall Kant's discussion of that, meaning not beauty that confirms the truth of a concept, and not beauty that gives us a good feeling about the morally good, but beauty is a value in and of itself that's not reducible to a practical or moral satisfaction, or the affirmation or confirmation or satisfaction of a concept. Now, this is something that Subin asked me before class. So we have different words in Hegel that are sometimes translated as the same word in the original German, but then we also have different use of these terms than Kant was using them anyway. So if you recall, the understanding is about concepts, theories, etc. So the beautiful has to go beyond the concept of the beautiful. The experience of the beautiful goes beyond our mere concept of the beautiful. So that's a concept Begriff. And I said, concept in English is a kind of a meaningless word, meaning it's a Latin word, so we're completely divorced from the visceral meaning of it. So Begriff, because English is a Germanic language, we can have a sense that you grasp something with a concept. You apprehend it, as another Latin. Concept also means that with which we grasp something. Begriff. It's concept, then there's idea, and then there's ideal, And then finally, there's another term, a Vorstellung. It's like an image, a particular kind of image, like a kind of a guiding image, Vorstellung. And that would also, so it would correspond to when we think of like an ideal, something that we're kind of striving after. Right? It could be rendered differently in the original German text than we're going to get it rendered in English translation. Just something to keep in mind. But also what came up was how the concept has a different status in Hegel than it did in Kant. Meaning when Hegel says concept, he means something closer to what Kant meant with idea. So if you recall, when we make a judgment of the beautiful, it's not according to our concept of the beautiful, but it is according to our idea of the beautiful. Hegel would use concept in that latter sense. So what does that mean? So it has to do with the relation between concept and object. So Kant would say we grasp the object with a concept in a theoretical way according to our understanding. So Hegel is going to have a dialectic of concept and object, meaning that what's interesting is not just that we're grasping it at that level of the understanding, but also that our concept of something might be not identical with and even contradict the object. So we have to think about the relation between the two. So that why that comes up with the symbolic right away is that in Hegel, this dialectic of concept and object can mean that the object aspires to its concept, or the object strives to attain its concept. Right, so there's a kind of, again, a process of becoming in which an object attains to its concept, and conversely, in which a concept attains to its object. Right, so the concept strives for its object, the object strives for its concept. That's going to sound like the more idea or ideal realm than just the big kind of conceptual apprehension, a kind of understanding, a theory. Now, the classical, on the other hand, is the attainment. Not the striving for, but the attainment. So it is the attainment of the identity of concept and object, or the realization of the idea of something. As opposed to, why this would be associated with religion for Hegel is that, and he talks about this in terms of the history of art, how literal are we supposed to take religious representations, or religious images, or religious symbols? Are they meant to be taken very literally? In one way, they're meant to be taken utterly literally. In another sense, they're merely symbolic. Meaning it's the non-identity of the presentation, of the form, and its content. That's another way of thinking about it. So concept and object, you could also think of as a relationship of form and content. The form aspires to be true to its content aspires to find its true form. Right? So the symbolic would, again, be that striving, be that kind of non-identity, religious mystery. So the idea that you are seeing God through an intermediary form that is not identical, but that remains unrepresentable. Whereas with the classical, there's more of a sense of, no, in fact, this can be represented, it can be presented, it can be rendered as an image. So that would be art, right? So correspond to religion, art, and then romantic forms of art are in this phase of the philosophical, in which, again, there's a non-identity of the form and the content, or the the idea and its manifestation, but not as a mere striving for, but as a transcendence. So the non-identity has a transcendental character rather than a mere striving character. Now, what he says about beauty, something to keep in mind for next week with Nietzsche. So he talked about pure appearance. There's, in Nietzsche, the appearance of appearance. The appearance of appearance. And it's a very similar thought figure to what Hegel's talking about here. So art is where the appearance of appearance can happen. So it's where we can see manifest the realm of appearance itself. Nietzsche's going to say something very similar. That art is about the appearance of appearance. Now, again, in this transcendental mode of the romantic, the appearance of appearance means that art allows us to be more reflective, critically reflective even, of the way things appear to us. So it's not an appearance of a divine mystery of unrepresentable truth. That would be the symbolic. Nor is it this kind of attainment in which the truth appears, but rather the latter, the romantic, allows us to consider the way things appear as appearance as such. And again, for Hegel, that's a step forward, that's an advancement, that's a development of our self-consciousness. Go ahead.
So you said at the beginning that art is like the expression of the ideal, right? And religion is the representation. But like with philosophy, what does he mean by transcendence of the ideal? Like, does creating new truth or what?
Sure. So where would the truth happen? Right. So the truth in the symbolic would happen in its kind of striving, its non-identity, its mystery. In the classical, the truth would happen in the appearance. So where does the truth happen with the romantic? It happens between the appearance, the sensuous manifestation, and our philosophical reflection of it. Right? So it's kind of like two parts of the truth that, again, the romantics are saying, oh no, they've become divorced from each other. And he's saying, no, this is actually a higher form. This isn't like this isn't a disintegration. Even though, what's interesting is that the romantic does tend to go back to the symbolic. In other words, why the romantics are attracted to not only classical antiquity as an ideal, but also towards medieval religious forms. And they start to think of art as this kind of mysterious, divine process. So there's a kind of a falling back from the idea of the artist as agent, more into the realm of the artist as kind of witness to a kind of divine mystery. But he thinks that that's a incorrect self-understanding on the part of the romantics. That in that form of kind of going back to the symbolic, actually what they're expressing is the transcendence. Right, so he's reinterpreting this crisis of the classical and the romantic in a way that's different from at least the way some of the romantics understood it themselves in their self-understanding of it. Right, so the issue is art itself. Right? In other words, if the romantics and also modernists, if artists try to go back to religion, it isn't actually as religion. It's as aesthetic. Because a lot of romantic work, a lot of modernist work actually was done with a self-understanding of like trying to go back to religion.
Imitation or mimicry?
Well, the content and the form. And in other words, if form and content are divorced in some way, then maybe it's because this is the presence of a divine mystery. That's what's being manifested. Right. Okay, we did talk about this, about the status of the work of art.
I think we talked about most of it.
Well, I'm sure that we didn't, because we were only on the first few pages, right? All right, here's another set of categories for us to consider. The immediate and the mediated. The immediate and the mediated. Right, so why this reversal from Kant, where for Kant, the appearance of nature is really the expression of freedom rather than art. So art is a kind of derivative phenomenon from the appearance of nature. Well, precisely because nature has the illusion of spontaneity, of autonomous appearance, in a way that anything created by humans lacks that. It seems more artificial. So for Hegel, he flips that around. So he's saying, well, no, because after all, for Kant, it was for the subject. It's not in the object, the beautiful. For Hegel, the mediated character of art, the fact that art is not immediate appearance of nature, is its advantage. Because it allows us to get at mediation as such or get at appearance as such. In a way that with nature we project it outside of ourselves. With art we can actually own it as our own, as ourselves. Because it's a human creation. We don't have to project it outside of ourselves. Right, so if we think that nature is freer than humanity, that's an illusion. That's a projection onto nature. Whereas art shows us that actually it's our own freedom.
What does it mean by art commands the whole with contribution?
Formations, right? Or forms. Right, so again, and Kant talked about this. Nature doesn't have forms in itself, right? It's pretty much random permutations. So it's only in our apprehension of it that it has form, right? So in that respect, we're always looking at nature as if it were a work of art. So for Kant, we look at a work of art as if it's nature. For Hegel, we're looking at nature as if it were a work of art. Again, this isn't entirely different from Kant, because the teleological being, the intelligent design, right, that we regard nature as if it were designed, and that's an illusion. Right, it's ascribing to nature an intentionality and a freedom that nature actually lacks. Right, so again, we look at nature as if it were a work of art. It's not a work of art. It's a work of entropy. It's chaos. I mean, I don't know. The Manichaeans would object. They would say, oh no, there's not just chaos, there's also order. Right? It's order and chaos. Well, but again, whether nature has a spontaneous order, what counts is how we regard that order, how we see that order. And we will always be changing our sense of the order of nature. We'll be complexifying, developing will be increasing our sense of the order of nature. But actually what that is the development of our apprehension of nature. It's not,
Nature.
yeah, so again, we might think, oh, we're understanding nature more and more. Well, we are, but really we're understanding ourselves more and more. And it's out of that we're understanding nature more and more. So if you remember Schiller, he said, okay, I'm going to write these letters, but I don't know anything. I'm just communing with myself.
So it's almost like if nature is chaos and we as individuals subjectively understand nature, it's weird. There's like just platypus and then individuals have like this selective library or place kind of.
We're giving it the order that it appears to have.
Yeah.
That's the idea. Now, of course, we're not doing that in isolation, right? Again, it's subjective, but it's not merely subjective. So, part of the, kind of textbook account of the history of philosophy, but also part of the self-description of this philosophy, is that Kant is subjective idealism and Hegel is objective idealism. So the point being that, of course, you don't have an object without a subject, nor do you have a subject without an object. Right, so again, the use of these terms is not in our colloquial sense of, okay, if something objective is wholly outside of us, or something subjective is merely subjective. Well, no, because nothing is wholly outside of us. We are part of nature. In Hegel's terms, we're the self-conscious part of nature. So even when he says we are higher, even the most foolish thought that we have is higher than the sun, but we're part of the same nature as the sun. And in fact, we're giving expression to the self-consciousness of the sun as part of nature. Right, so the movement of nature and spirit is the self-movement of nature. The self-consciousness of spirit is actually the self-consciousness of nature. Supposedly. Right, so that higher, it's kind of like, when we think of it in terms of the higher things, but also the higher parts of ourselves. In other words, when we have a recognition of something as beautiful, isn't that a higher recognition than a mood? Like we have a sense in our own experience of ourselves of higher and lower phenomena. We do. Right? We do consider some things to be the better part of ourselves.
But that's only by comparison.
Sure. Or in relation.
In relation.
Or in relation. Meaning, if we're the self-consciousness of the sun, we're higher than the sun, because the sun wants to become self-conscious of itself, but how did it do so? By fostering life on Earth until it evolved to the point where it could say, I know what the sun is. And then the sun is like, I'm so happy that someone knows what I am. The sun wanted to become self-conscious, and we are that self-consciousness. That's pure Hegel, trippy, Hegeliana right there.
I was wondering if there's possibility to develop or evolve, develop, like the level of our self-consciousness can be developed, or is there a definite point for Hegel?
Yes, of course. I mean, children, do you have a higher self-consciousness now than when you were 5 years old? I hope so. I hope so. And not just because, as the school tells me, the brain is not fully developed. until you're 30. So we should be very careful with the children because we're dealing with not fully developed brains. Yeah, I don't know. It might be that the brain isn't fully developed until you're 30, but once you're out of college, you stop developing. In other words, you might be better at, like, I don't know, commuting on the train, getting to work on time at 30 than you were at 22, but I don't know if that's like a real development of self-consciousness. No, I don't think so. Like, your neurology might be better for capitalism at age 30 than at age 22. Maybe. You guys have heard that, haven't you?
I think it's 25.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
I wanted to get as young as possible because it's like I don't want students to have any excuses. I mean, thankfully, I'm not teaching high school because I don't think I could. Well, I also don't think I can be a babysitter. Even though I'm in loco parentis. Do you know that we're in loco parentis with undergrads? Do you know what in loco parentis? So the school is in the place of the parent, in loco parentis, but I more like in parentis loco. Like if the Art Institute is loco parentis, it's because it's loco. It's not because it's parentis. Sorry, children. So yes, we stand in a higher relationship to ourselves. No problem. All right, so rational. Art is rational. Art is a rational necessity. We need art. But for what? Right. What do we need art for? There's going to be something for us to keep in mind. It's not in the texts that we're reading, but it's part of the Enlightenment milieu. It's part of the kind of ethos. I might have mentioned before, but it's going to be very important next week when we get into Nietzsche. Art should be more than either entertainment or propaganda. Okay, so what does that mean? Art is entertainment and propaganda, but it should be more than that. And what does the more consist of? The more consists of the aesthetic form itself. Meaning, entertainment and propaganda are practical uses for art. And it comes from the castes. The warrior caste needs art for entertainment. The church needs art for propaganda. And the peasants, the folk, need art for both propaganda and entertainment. They need it for aesthetic instruction and practical behavior as well as a diversion from that laboring activity. So art that is autonomous, art that meets its rational need and its spiritual freedom transcends the aesthetic forms that have a practical purpose, including the practical purpose of conveying an idea, as in religious art, propaganda. So art is, most of the time, entertainment and or propaganda, but it should be more than that. In other words, it should have a value as art. So again, it should have a value in its mode of appearance itself, rather than in the purpose for that appearance, outside itself. Okay, so here's a point that I think we talked about did we talk about Plato? Did we talk about the ethereal realm of eternal forms? Where ideal forms exist even though they don't exist in the phenomenal world. So the noumenal realm that must exist because we have these ideas of these forms, whereas in empirical reality, they never appear. So there's no straight line or circle or rectilinear form in nature, but only in our ideas. Right, so I offered that when Plato says this, he might say it semi-ironically. In other words, that may not be literal. It may not literally be an ethereal realm of eternal forms, and yet we must imagine that there is, since we don't observe these forms in empirical reality. So I mentioned that Kant flips that around and says, well, no, we don't have these ideas and then fail to observe them in reality. That would be a version of a true essence, but a false appearance. But we have these ideas because we want these things in reality. In other words, we conceive of straight lines, circles, and rectilinear forms because we're trying to bring them about in practice. We're trying to remake the world according to that ideal form. Right, so again, for Hegel, that would be the question of where forms come from. Right, so the universal character of form would not be the universality of this ethereal realm of eternal forms, but rather would be in the universality of freedom. So form here, and even the ideal form, is something that we are responsible for. It's our doing. That's what gives it its character of freedom. There's something in your notes that jumped out at me that I wanted to mention. Oh, the bad transitory world. All right, the bad transitory world. It actually speaks to something that came up earlier regarding like our personal experience of time, the infinite versus finitude. So what is infinite is not humans. Humans are not. Spirit is. Right. So as organic beings, as creaturely organisms, we die. But the ideas live on. The forms live on. History lives on. Society lives on. Right. So we transcend our finitude. So we are finite beings, but we are able to transcend our finitude. How? Well, art is one of the ways that we do. And not just because works of art might outlive us physically, but again, because the aesthetic form and the ideas that are manifest there would transcend our particular finite existence. Right? And that's why it goes beyond immediacy in the form of mediation. This is how he's justifying attention to the artwork itself, because the artwork itself has a value in itself as a form of mediation. But again, then you're dealing with, well, what is the artwork? The artwork is not just a physical object. It's our reception of it. It's our viewing of it or listening or reading. So we see more in the physical object of the artwork than is there, because there actually is more there than is physically there. That's form. All right, how are we doing? We're actually running out of time. This is terrible. Okay. Right. So we talked about society. talked about it as community. In other words, it's not just a conventional group of people. It's not a group of humans and their social conventions, but it's actually community in this broader sense of our relations, but also the development of our relations. We change and we develop and complexify, because that's really one of his other points. Why we might live in a philosophical world now is that in a more abstract and conceptually mediated world now is actually because it's a more complex world. So this is a bit counterintuitive, because we might think, oh, aren't practices more complex than concepts? And aren't aesthetic forms of appearance more complex even than practices? Right? Isn't religion more complicated, especially because it's so mysterious, than philosophy? Isn't art more complex than philosophy? Yes, looked at that way. However, looked at another way, we live in a complex set of social relations that defies the ability to be recognizable, to be apprehensible, either in morally symbolic forms or in just aesthetic forms alone. Right, so the complexity would be, well, we still have morally symbolic forms, we still have religion, we still have art, we still have aesthetic forms, but we also have philosophy. And so the complexity is between philosophy and art, or between philosophy and religion. It's not that philosophy itself is more complex, of course it isn't. But it's the relationship between philosophy and art that gives expression to that complexity in a way that art on its own could not. And philosophy on its own could not. Especially if we think that philosophy is just some kind of logical formula, which it isn't. Right. I always like to remind, this also came up in our discussion, Subin, that there's a lot of academic philosophy. The academic discipline of philosophy, a lot of it, rejects Hegel completely as nonsense.
Why is that?
Because it's illogical. Because it doesn't fit a mathematical formula. Right? Therefore, it's unrigorous. It's too based on like touchy-feely intuition, right? Schopenhauer, who taught a class or had an office down the hall from Hegel. And so no one came to Schopenhauer's class, but everyone went to Hegel's class, and Schopenhauer was like, yeah, fucking Hegel. People think he's profound, it's all nonsense. Nietzsche, we'll see, has his Schopenhauerianism, especially next week. No, that's poor Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer is worth more than that. Schopenhauer is worth more than his sour grapes about Hegel. Right? But there was that. And we just have to think, well, why did Schopenhauer think that? Because sometimes you're reading Hegel and you're like, I'm not quite sure. Right? Did he just pull a fast one? Is there hand waving, as they say? Is there a lot of hand waving involved? There might be. No, there's substance. It's the substance of spirit, the substance of freedom.
Does hand waving mean like someone is being a magician or being like a dictator?
No, it means magician. It doesn't mean dictator. Do dictators wave their hands? I guess Trump does, but he's not a dictator. He's a democratic demagogue. It's a big difference. Mussolini probably waved his hands a lot, because Italians talk with their hands. I talk with my hands. No, Mussolini was just a hysteric. He was like a Looney Tune if you watch the films of Mussolini. I don't know which other dictators. Do we have any good dictators in mind?
He waved his hand.
Yeah.
I don't know about they do, but
Putin doesn't wave his hands. And neither does Xi wave his hands. No, they can barely lift their arms.
Exactly.
Right? Or maybe it's all in their eyes. Maybe that's where all the hand waving happens.
I was like just imagining something.
Oh, you mean like that? Like that's not hand waving. That's more like angry gesticulation. No, hand waving is more like like you're kind of waving it away. You're just like, oh yeah, right? I don't know where these terms come from. All the logical fallacies, you can look them up on Wikipedia. And then there's the fallacy, which is the idea that you've proven something by showing that it's a logical fallacy. That's a fallacy. All right. Anyway, Hegel is guilty of all the fallacies. But also he's not guilty of all those fallacies. All right, see you next week.
Thank you.